The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 15, My Pal Hal, in which film collector and prior guest Jim Reed joins me to talk to today's guest about one of the pioneers of screen comedy.
What a beautiful morning. Turn on the radio and let's have some music.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. As I mentioned, my friend Jim Reed, who was my guest a couple of episodes back, comes aboard today as co-host, or maybe color commentator. We haven't really sorted out the job description. Anyhow, our guest is Craig Kallman, a gentleman who formed a unique friendship with legendary producer Hal Roach during the last years of his life, which resulted in Craig's book, 100 Years of Brodies with Hal Roach, The Jaunty Journeys of a Hollywood Motion Picture and Television Pioneer. Jim, it's good to have you back. And Craig, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate your inviting me.
Now then, people with passing familiarity with silent films, whether specifically comedy or not, are pretty likely to know the name Mack Sennett. And I think most of them are going to know Hal Roach. But for anyone who really isn't that well versed in that era, they should know that Hal Roach was at least as significant as Mack Sennett, and for a time they were close competitors. So before we get into the specifics of your book, why don't you give us kind of a thumbnail of who Hal Roach was and what he accomplished? Not too much detail, because that'll remove probably a lot of questions that we might have going on.
Okay. Well, I should say that Mack Sennett started his Keystone studio in 1912, and they were immediately successful and famous. That was the year that Hal Roach, as a 20-year-old, arrived in Hollywood and became a cowboy extra over at the Universal Studios, specifically for Bison. So in 1912, Mack Sennett was firmly established as head of a studio. Hal Roach was a 20-year-old who had been in Alaska and Washington, and he was put in charge of bringing a bunch of old trucks down to the Los Angeles area. Then he saw an ad, Cowboy Extras Wanted, and since he could ride a horse, had a cowboy outfit, he applied and he was hired. It only took Hal Roach 2 years to form his own studio, and it was very small at the beginning, no rival to Mack Sennett, but definitely within a few years, he had a very prosperous studio going on. Despite all the publicity, he told me that he and Mack Sennett were friends. They were not rivals, but they were competitors in a sense, certainly, but there was no animosity between them. So Hal Roach grew up in a small town in upstate New York, Elmira, and traveled west. And he was the star of his football team. He was a very gregarious fellow. He was the perfect guy to form a family-oriented movie studio at the beginnings of Hollywood. Is that a nutshell enough for us to begin with?
Sure. I'd say we're off and running. Now, before we start grilling you, I should mention that Jim's presence here should be especially valuable, given that his massive film collection began in earnest with the films of Laurel and Hardy, who were cultivated as a team by Hal Roach. Aside from the huge presence of Laurel and Hardy in Jim's collection, he has many other films produced by Roach featuring other teams and stars. Consequently, he's likely in a position to offer up more informed questions and commentary than I am. In fact, I can't help but wonder if I shouldn't just go get a bite to eat while the two of you carry on the conversation. But that would be abdicating my responsibilities as host. So I'll do my best to keep up.
I think you're overselling me.
Well, that remains to be seen. But feel free to jump in at any time.
Okay.
Now, to begin with, Craig, perhaps it would be good for you to explain the title, 100 Years of Brodies with Hal Roach. What exactly does that mean?
That's the number one question. Brodies. Brodies is a term Hal Roach himself used many times. And I meant to ask him when I first met him. I was only 20 years old when I met him, to interview him for my UCLA school paper. And he used the term Brodies numerous times. I wrote it down. I spelled it Brodie with a question mark. I had no idea what it was. It was years later, only when I began researching my book, that I discovered exactly what that means. Now, I hesitate to reveal the exact description because I don't know how many potential readers I might lose if they go, oh, that's what Brodies is. I don't have to buy the book and read it. But I will say that it was a 19th century slang term. And if anyone is familiar with the 1933 movie The Bowery, starring George Raft and Wallace Beery, and about 30 Hal Roach supporting players, you'll find out the whole story about Steve Brodie, the Brooklyn Bridge, and what led to this term being used in the late 19th, early 20th century that applied to clowns, slapstick artists, etc.
Okay. Let's hope that is enough of a tease that'll motivate people to pick up your book, as opposed to something silly like wanting to read about Hal Roach.
Exactly.
Now, the thing that I couldn't help but notice in this, it's got a very unique design and structure. It's not a typical biography. It doesn't really flow in that way. It's almost like an annotated journal. And I presume that that's intentional and that that's partially based on the material that you were working from. So can you kind of tell us about how the book came about? And also, if you want to expand on your background a little more, I mean, you mentioned, your UCLA paper and everything, but if you, like I say, if you want to flesh that out a little bit and the specifics of how you came to meet Hal Roach,
Sure. Well, I have to address the structure of the book you mentioned. It is basically in chronological order. It all began with my being invited by Mr. Roach to interview him. And I asked him to describe his career because I knew nothing about him. This was years before the internet, I was recently arrived as an undergraduate at UCLA. I'd never been in a big city like LA before. I had grown up in San Diego, California, where I picked up my dad's 8mm movie camera and started making movies. In high school, I actually made comedies, silent comedies with my schoolmates, one of which, believe it or not, was a Laurel and Hardy style comedy, which was a big hit in the school. They showed it in the auditorium. I was so proud, but that is my hats off, I'm afraid. It was called, Is There a Gardener in the House? I played James Finlayson, the doctor. It was sort of a spoof on the Saps at Sea scene with Finlayson as the doctor, because there was a fat boy and a skinny boy in my class that were clowns goofing around together. So I said to them one day, why don't we make a Laurel and Hardy type comedy? And that's how that all began. And then when I learned about Black Hawk Films, I started collecting the silent films. And I think it was 1970 when I had the funds to actually buy a sound projector, and I bought some of their early talkies. And then I would have screenings with my neighbors and whatnot. So that was my rudimentary beginnings of my love of old films and old comedies and classic Hollywood. No, and then you had several parts to your question. I'm seeing, what else should I?
Oh, I'm known to do that. It sounds like we had several things in common. I actually was also making some student films in high school, and I made a couple that were sort of in the vein of Laurel and Hardy. One would be called a one-reeler. The other one aspired to be a feature, but I never completed it. But I enjoyed making them, and they're fun to look back on.
So I made numerous films in high school, And then I went to college, Forest Grove, Oregon, Pacific University. It's the oldest university west of the Mississippi. And I had a wonderful theater professor there. He encouraged me as an actor. I became a stage actor and started learning about writing plays and the structure of plays and dialogue and all that sort of thing. Then I heard about a study program to Mexico, and I'd always wanted to explore Mexico. By that time, I had a Bolex Super 8 camera. And when I was accepted to study down there, and I was a very adventurous young man, I took my movie camera and I traveled everywhere. Mountains, jungles, little villages, the huge city of Mexico City. And I gathered so much material. I made a 40-minute documentary when I got home to California that summer. And on a whim, I sent it to UCLA Film School and applied for their film school. And sure enough, I was accepted. So in the fall of 1973, I found myself living in the dorms of UCLA, which was just a short distance from the hallowed hills of Bel Air. And one day I thought, gee, it's 1973. Are there any old timers from the early days of Hollywood still around? Again, I was very naive. I didn't know how to do the research or anything. I knew Stan Laurel had passed away when I was about 12 and Ollie had long gone, but I thought of Hal Roach. He would be in his early 80s. Could he still be alive? I looked up in the phone book. Remember, we used to have phone book. And there was the name Hal Roach in Bel Air, a phone number. So I called up the number and a little girl answered the phone. I said, is this the home of Hal Roach, who used to be a movie producer? She said, yes, it is. I said, oh, may I speak to him, please? She goes, just a minute. Grandpa, telephone. And next thing I knew, I was actually talking to Hal Roach. I told him my love of Laurel and Hardy, the fact that I was a young film student, and just spontaneously, I said, may I interview you for my school paper? I mean, I wasn't part of any school paper, but I thought if I ever wrote a paper, I'd have a school paper. And he said, sure. He says, next week, such and such a time, meet me at the Bel Air Country Club. I'll be in the card room. I said, you bet, Mr. Roach. Thank you. And that's how it all began. I met him in the card room. It was hilarious because it was a big room full of all kinds of old gentlemen playing cards, having a great time. Yeah, I had no idea what Hal Roach looked like at that point, but he was a jolly man. I figured he looked like he was in his early 60s when he was actually 81. And he said, deal me out, boys. I've got an interview to conduct. So we went to a private room and we just got along great. He liked my sense of humor, and he was pretty astonished at all. I knew so many details about the Laurel and Hardy silence and the talkies and whatnot. By that point, we just had a great conversation. He was fascinating to listen to. He was gregarious, charming, a lot of fun. It lasted almost 3 hours. And we had about a 3-hour interview after that. So that became my term paper. I was enrolled in history of the American comedy, film comedy at UCLA. Professor Bradley was his name, and he gave me an A+ on the paper. So that was a great start.
No, it was hard to imagine that you could have a better subject for your paper.
Exactly. And,
Jim, did you have something
Well, I may be jumping the gun on this, but I was just going to ask a question about the source, because there's a lot of memos and telegrams and that sort of thing in the book. And were those all at, was it USC or the Academy, or where did you get those?
Okay, that was years later. Okay, at this point in the early 70s, that was my big project, creating this paper for Hal Roach. And how did I know this 81-year-old man would live nearly 20 years longer and have his marbles all the way to the end, and that we would maintain a friendship? I didn't know that at the beginning. So a few years went by. When I saw him again, he remembered me. He said, come on up to the house. So there I met him again. And then by that time I was living in New York City. I became a professional stage actor and writing plays and traveling around pretty much as an actor and devoted to the theater. I had no connection with film or television at that time. And next thing you know, I'm back in LA. I moved back to LA around 1987, I believe it was. And in 1988, I think at the very beginning of the year, I read that Laurel and Hardy, a number of their Spanish shorts had been restored. They were going to have their premiere screening at UCLA. So of course I went. And remember, I had lived in Mexico. I learned to speak fluent Spanish. I was so curious to see and hear Laurel and Hardy in Spanish. And it was a revelation because not only were they funny, just naturally.
Where were you born?
I don't know.
Fancy not knowing where you were born.
Well, I was too young to remember.
But their accents in Spanish, which were so understandable, this is the amazing thing, but with funny accents, doubled the comedy for people who knew Spanish.
Donde naciste?
No sé.
Que no sabes?
No me acuerdo. Estaba muy chico.
I don't think they were as successful in French because that is a notoriously difficult language for Americans to master. And it's kind of painful. I know a little French, and listening to them speak French is a bit of a challenge, but their Spanish was hilarious. So the head of the UCLA Film School at the time was Robert Rosen, and he came up to me. He said, "Do you know Hal Roach is looking for a writing assistant?" I said, "You're kidding me." He said, "No, he really is. So give him a call." So I did. And he told me that he wanted to have someone help him create the script for his comeback comedy. He called it a comeback comedy. Well, at this point, he was 96 years of age. And he said, I go to bed early. I have limited energy. He said, "Do you think you would be willing to live in my home while we do this project so that, when I have the energy and you be available, we can work on the script?" And I thought, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, I was already working and I had my own apartment. It wasn't like I needed a place to live, but I couldn't turn this opportunity down. So it was April 4, 1988 is the day I moved into his home and began a whole new adventure with Mr. Roach. At that stage, I was focused on his project. It didn't even occur to me to write a book about him. He had an associate named Richard W. Bann, who was very big in the Sons of the Desert community, who had been helping Mr. Roach in many ways. And everybody thought he would be writing a biography on Hal Roach. In fact, I offered him. Over the years, I added to my original paper. And every time I would visit or talk with Mr. Roach, I would make notes. And eventually I had a 75-page document, which I sent to Mr. Bann because I thought he was writing a biography. I didn't think of doing it myself. I never heard a word from him about it. The years go by. Mr. Roach passes away. Years and years go by. I'm expecting somebody to write a biography about Mr. Roach and his incredible career. I found out that William K. Everson, the historian, wrote a very thin volume in 1971, which really was more or less an outline. And then I think it was 2005, Ward, Richard Ward, was it?
Yes.
Wrote a book, but it was very business oriented and profit and loss and very detailed in that regard.
Right.
It was lacking a lot of the human element. So I found myself living in 2011. I think I moved close to USC, University of Southern California. I had published a photograph of Clayton Johnson. Do you know the writer? He wrote for The Twilight Zone. Was it William Clayton Johnson? He was a wonderful old gentleman. I took a great picture of him and put it on the internet. Out of the blue, I was contacted by Bear Manor Media. They said, "We'd like to use your photo. We're doing a book about Mr. Johnson." And I said, "Sure." I'd never heard of Bear Manor Media. They said, "Oh, we specialize in publishing books about classic Hollywood." I said, "That's great." I said, "Do you know I have a 75-page article about Hal Roach?" I even have photos I took of the time I stayed with him and whatnot. And they were eager to publish that. Well, I was preparing that, a 75-page book, when someone said, did you know the Hal Roach collection is at USC? They have his business papers there. I said, you're kidding me. Well, I have to explore this. So I got permission to go to USC, the Cinematic Arts Library. I met the wonderful librarian, Ned Comstock, who has helped numerous researchers over the decades. And he was a very helpful gentleman. And next thing I knew, I contacted Bear Manor. I said, look, I have found a treasure trove of original studio documents, letters, telegrams from 1914 to the late 50s. I have to explore all this material. And they said, go ahead. We have no time limit. So I spent, I would say, close to 2 years going through virtually every paper I could find in that collection to write my book. And I found amazing facts and details. Plus I filled them in with all sorts of film trade magazines that I explored from the earliest days. Of course, books. Fortunately, USC had a fantastic collection of cinema books, not to mention the magazines, not to mention, any number of things, reading materials and whatnot, pamphlets. And I learned so many things that when I knew Mr. Roach, he didn't share a fraction of all his accomplishments. He was not a man to brag or reminisce about the past unless he was specifically asked certain questions. For example, we'd have dinner in his dining room, which had photographs of all these celebrities all over the walls. So I would ask him, oh, what about this? And who is that? And, Will Rogers. He taught me how to play polo, and I starred him in a series of comedies, this, that, and the other. He had a picture of Mussolini. What? You knew Mussolini? Well, that's a whole other story. He had a picture of JFK. He had a fantastic, huge photograph at, I don't know if it was Marion Davies Beach House with all the luminaries of the 20s there. So I realized what an incredible career this man has had and all the people he's known. But in real life, he was modest, just avuncular, I felt like he was my grandpa in a way, like a very charming grandfather type.
Yeah, one of the things that comes through in your writing about those, at least those early years, is the sense of fun that apparently permeated his studio that I guess kind of became its reputation.
Oh, this man loved fun. Yes, he loved fun. He loved a good time, a good fun time. And you could see he knew how to attract the right people, and he wanted clean comedy. There was a lot of risque stuff, especially in the 20s, I don't know what to say. I think, Mark Twain, he told me he was very impressed. Mark Twain had a summer home in his town of Elmira, and he was very impressed when Mark Twain came to his school, or perhaps it was his Sunday school, to talk to the children. And when I thought about it, I realized, well, Hal Roach sort of exemplifies that Americana of Mark Twain, that gentle humor, the connection with simple folk and country ways, that sort of thing. And that is very true. And that's the kind of man he was.
Yeah, that seems to be reflected in a lot of the films. And of course, it would make it a natural for he and Will Rogers to become friends.
Right. And then I realized he got along. Now, I was an eccentric kind of clownish character that he just immediately understood. And I realized, well, of course, he got along well with all these clowns and the technicians and the workers there and the businessmen. He could relate to people of all strata of society, just naturally. He was that kind of a guy.
And again, that's something else that shows through in the films. I mean, whether we're talking about the films of Harold Lloyd as kind of the everyman, the eager young lad, including also then the Our Gang kids, just basic kids.
What do they know about golf?
Shot in 74 yesterday. 74 strokes for 18 holes?
No, that was just for the first hole. But I cut it down to 64 for the second.
Right. He told me the day he looked out his window and he saw kids playing in the railroad yard out there. And he realized this is fascinating, just watching ordinary kids playing. And that's where he got the idea. He didn't want showbiz kids with their stage mothers and that kind of phony stuff. He wanted real natural kids. And thank goodness he found a man like Robert McGowan, who just was a natural relating to kids. And they created a wonderful atmosphere. It was a very wonderful, the lot of fun, they called it. Roach was a very gregarious and fair-minded man. I could mention the Stan and Ollie movie, which had a scene of a kind of a nasty, money-grubbing producer.
Yeah, pure fiction.
It was pure fiction. I know Hal Roach would have been furious. He would have wanted to sue them because, do you remember back in the early 90s, they made a television movie about Thelma Todd. It was called Hot Toddy. Well, I watched it, and the next day I called Hal Roach. Obviously, he watched it too, and he says, I'm going to sue them. They came to my house one day and asked me all about Thelma Todd. We had a long conversation, and then they went and made their own movie. And I said, well, you're right, Mr. Roach. It was not accurate, and the way they portrayed you was terrible. Yeah, it's detailed in my book, our lengthy conversation about what he thought of that. So you can imagine his reaction would have been what that would have been to the Stan and Ollie movie. Yeah. Totally unfair.
Yeah. Now, of these, just to kind of go down the list here, we've mentioned Harold Lloyd, Our Gang, Laurel and Hardy, Will Rogers, and then also Charlie Chase, who I guess started out as essentially a writer and then director and ultimately became a star in his own right.
Another fine mess you've gotten us into. If you hadn't insisted upon stopping, we wouldn't have been robbed.
And if you hadn't insisted upon us going to California, listen to me, and going to Michigan, we wouldn't have been robbed either.
That isn't true. There's just as big crooks in Michigan as there is in California.
There are not. They're bigger in California. It's the climate.
Oh, poppycock.
Oh, fiddlesticks.
Oh, Charlie.
Oh, mother knows best.
We've got the Thelma Todd and Zazu Bits series.
Let me at him,
Honey,
Let me at him.
Honey, don't get excited now. Just relax. Remember that old saying, relax. Hush thy angry passion. Just be calm. Like me, to sit down and relax.
And then Zazu Pitts was replaced by Patsy Kelly for the run of those.
Hello, Colossal Studios? Well, you know the blonde that you're waiting for to do the lead for the horse thief test? You know, the blonde with the blue eyes?
Yeah, that's it.
Well, they're black now. Right, too bad. Well, hey, wait a minute. How about trying out Todd? Why, the Thelma Todd, of course. You know, the girl from Joplin, Missouri who made good?
And then, of course, there's...
Gentlemen, if you'll just permit me, I have an announcement to make. Mr. Roach has requested me to tell you folks out there that he has added another star to his already well-known firmament. A very great star, in fact, Mr. Harry Langdon. Mr. Roach has the greatest confidence in the world in Mr. Langdon, and I know that Harry is with Mr. Roach, heart and soul.
Who seems, I don't know, maybe the most enigmatic, would that be the right word, of the whole lot. Were there any interesting insights regarding him that you learned?
Oh, well, not when I knew Mr. Roach. In those days, those early talkies that Harry Langdon made for Roach were completely lost, apparently, or I knew nothing about those. I focused on the stars we know about today. It was only years later that I discovered all the various... Roach was like experimenting. He had a hunch, and he had the crazy animal shorts called the Dippy Doodads. He tried starring all sorts of actors. Well, one of the early ones was Toto, a clown from New York City that he starred in a few films. There was Clyde Cook. There was Glenn Tryon. Then there were some women. He made some fascinating serials with Edna Murphy. And then there was Beatrice LaPlante, all these forgotten stars now. But people don't realize he had so many various series that sometimes just lasted a season. He even starred James Finlayson to be a star in a few shorts, though he found his niche as Laurel and Hardy's nemesis, of course. And in the late 20s, he brought some, you might say, fading stars such as Theda Bara and Lionel Barrymore when he was sort of between jobs. He starred them in shorts. He was always trying something new and didn't hesitate to move on if it didn't really work. So, yeah, Thelma Todd. Now, with Charlie Chase, of course, what an incredible talent. He was multi-talented. And in the early talkies, Charlie wanted to co-star with Thelma Todd. And he was kind of disappointed when Hal Roach decided to team her with Zazu Pitts. But they made a few talkies together. I'm so glad in the last few years how the restoration projects of these early talkies, now you can see the early talkies of Charlie Chase, virtually all the films of Todd and Pitts and Todd and Patsy Kelly, and so many of the films have been restored, rediscovered, all the streamliners.
They did just release a set with the 5 Harry Langdon films, too.
Yes, that's right. That is really amazing. Langdon, he was an odd choice, of course. A very odd character. And how do you turn that strange baby-like character? How do you adapt that character to the talkies?
How do you do? How do you do, Mrs. Quimby?
How do you do?
Well, is Mr. Quimby at home?
No, Mr. Quimby is not at home.
Oh, Mr. Quimby is not at home.
No.
He's not in the house? He's not in the house? And he's not out there?
No.
Well, for goodness sakes, for goodness sakes, you and I better look into this matter, hadn't we?
I'm not worried about Mr. Quimby.
Oh, you're not worried? Oh, neither am I worried. Well, I care about Mr. Quimby, only I thought maybe as long as he's not home, and as long as he's not out here, I think that we ought to kind of look into things a little bit.
Some of it was a little awkward, yes, but towards the latter part of the series, they were hitting their stride, I thought. And some of them are very funny and some very funny scenes if the overall shorts didn't sort of match the quality of the others. But who can beat Laurel and Hardy? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. This is jumping back, kind of breaking the chronology here as we gradually work our way forward, but I don't want to let it get away from me. Now, you referenced the Lonesome Luke films of Harold Lloyd, which is one of the characters he did early on before he established the Glasses character, or Glass, because you made that distinction in there too. The Glass character is the correct term.
His daughter was very adamant about calling it the Glass character rather than the Glasses character because Harold called it the Glass character. Okay. So.
And as far as the Lonesome Luke films, you mentioned that I guess because they had been released by MGM, if I'm remembering this correctly, by MGM, they were in their vault. And so when the fire hit, that wiped them all out, except for a dozen that were not stored in there.
The vault was at Harold Lloyd's estate.
Okay. I did the research on this because there is some confusion about it all. I have it here succinctly, the facts. This is what I have done.
Okay.
For example, someone had said that, Hal Roach wasn't responsible for Laurel and Hardy becoming a team because he and his wife went on a many-month cruise around the world at that time. Well, I found out that was not true. He and his wife did not start their world cruise until January of 1928, by which time Laurel and Hardy were already an established team. Now, this thing about the vault fires, the loss of films, here it is in a nutshell. In 1938, there was a fire at the Pathé Exchange vault in New Jersey, and it destroyed many of those early films.
Okay, so I misremembered then. For some reason.
But no. But you were right about. In 1938, Lloyd purchased negatives of 114 of the surviving Pathé films. And this I quote from Annette D'Agostino Lloyd, no relation to Harold Lloyd, but she has written extensively about Harold Lloyd. She's written a great book about him. She says, quote, amongst the films now in his possession, that's late 1938, were much of his Lonesome Luke output and scores of the Glass Character one-reelers, along with all the multiple reel and feature-length films. Lloyd stored his prized possessions in a newly constructed film vault on his Green Acres estate. But 5 years later, in 1943, a nitrate explosion and fire ripped through the film vault, and most of the early films perished. I have the exact list here. Of the 67 Lonesome Luke films, 53 did not survive. So only 14 Lonesome Luke films from 1915 to 17 do exist. Of the 81 single-reel Glass Character shorts of 1917 to 1919, 63 are known to survive, while 18 are lost. The character that Lloyd played before Lonesome Luke, called Willie Work. Now that I am still in the process of trying to figure out how many Willie Work films were produced. Every source has a different number. The only one that exists, apparently, is Just Nuts, which is the first short of 1915 that Pathé agreed to release, and on that basis agreed to release the rest of Roach's productions. That started Hal Roach on his career, and Harold Lloyd. Just Nuts, that was a Willie Work film. Apparently that's the only one to survive. But his two reel Glass shorts from 1919 survived, 1922 and 23, that he made 3-reelers, 4-reelers, and features. They all survived, thank goodness. And who knows what we may discover in the near future, because exciting rediscoveries are always being made.
Yeah.
I know they've found another Lonesome Luke within the past 2 years.
Oh, really? I'd very much like to know about that.
Yeah.
Maybe you can email me. If you ever discover things like that, please let me know.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering if because at least my recollection in reading the book, of course, I already blew it with, confusing MGM and Pathé, but you had indicated at that point that a dozen had escaped the fire. So you mentioned that 14 survived. My question was going to be if any, since that original dozen had been discovered, having survived by being elsewhere. And so apparently 2 more. Is that pretty much?
Well, I don't know exactly when this article was written. It doesn't have a date. So it could have been, this could be 10 years old, 15 years old, or 5 years old. And who knows? I don't know the latest statistics on that.
Okay.
It'd be great to know.
I can send a message to Annette and see if she's got a count on that.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Well, one thing that was interesting I found is that apparently, according to your book, it reveals that Hal Roach, obviously a phenomenal producer, making the decisions, the artistic decisions that he did. But when it came to directing, although he evidently was very competent at it, he just really didn't seem to have all that much patience for it.
Well, he had an interesting relationship with directing. He wasn't one of those serious, Michael Curtiz or John Ford type directors. I think, now he never told me this specifically, and all the stories I've read about him being a sort of lackadaisical director, especially later. Now, in the early days, somebody had to direct those one-reelers, and so it was going to be him. He was the boss. He was the head guy. And he always corroborated with his actors. This is the thing. He wasn't a power-hungry guy needing to exert his, machismo or anything like that. He liked the camaraderie and the coming up with new ideas, and he didn't care where they came from. Well, of course, later in the 30s, he had some spats with Stan Laurel. But in those early days, I think it was just a heck of a lot of fun. Now, later, he said, I like to keep my hand in things. By the late 30s, and then, he brought D.W. Griffith out of retirement to help him with projects. One of the notorious stories about Hal Roach as not the greatest director was when he was directing Joan Bennett and Adolphe Menjou in The Housekeeper's Daughter. Came out about 1939. Well, apparently those two stars, and he paid them more money than he'd paid any other star up to that point. This is when he was trying to move beyond the slapstick comedy stage and, create respectable features that really rivaled the big studios. So he got the biggest stars and had the greatest production values and whatnot. But apparently, Joan Bennett and Adolphe Menjou accepted starring in this film based on the book. There was a bestseller, I think it was, that The Housekeeper's Daughter, and they said, sure, we'll do it. What they were horrified by was the script, apparently. The shooting script, I don't know what it was. I never got the details. Maybe the dialogue, maybe just the construction, something about it. They were not happy, but they couldn't get out of their contracts. So they would literally make fun of Hal Roach and the production they were in. And there was an article published in, I think it was Good Housekeeping or something, just revealing their kind of rather disdain of being in this production. I was pretty shocked to read that. And then Joan Bennett was very ticked off by the publicity that the Hal Roach Studios created for her film. And they made her character come across as a real floozy, which she wasn't, apparently, in the film. And she took such umbrage, she had her lawyers send hundreds of letters to women's clubs around the country saying she did not approve of this publicity. Her character was not as questionable as they're implying, and she would never have played that sort of a role. And do not construe this publicity as any validation on my part. I think that covers that. But he was a competent director. He wasn't a brilliant director. He was a brilliant producer, of course. But hey, it was his studio. If he wanted to direct some films, he certainly could.
Yeah. Well, so many of us, I think, even though if we're familiar with his career in general, we realize that it did extend, of course, well beyond the silence. But I still think a lot of us, when we hear Hal Roach, our mind goes back that far. To things like the original Laurel and Hardy's and the Our Gangs and all that, and then we just kind of work our way forward from there. Now, in terms of the transition to sound, found that interesting, what you documented in the book and commented on, that apparently he was pretty eager to make that transition, and most of his stars just really were completely good making that transition as well.
He was a pioneer, there's no doubt about it. And when you think about the various phases of Hollywood from 1914 and the steady development and progress through the 20s, and then that transition, yes, he was one of the very first. I found out that actually Mack Sennett released the first talkie short in late 1928. So he beat Hal Roach by a few months. But, of course, Roach just was so thorough with the Victor Talking Company, bringing the experts to his studio. He was going to get on top of it immediately. And yeah, it's incredible what he did. The smooth transition. Now, it was a little more difficult with the Our Gang kids, kids trying to teach them dialogue. I can't imagine how painful and painstaking that must have been.
The Oriental girls do the wild pagan dance to make
whoopee.
To make whoopee or soup. Not flummica? Both flummica. Well, anyway, Neil was in a terrible rage today.
And well, mate.
And well, mate, we all tremble in our pants.
Oh, good.
So it took a little while for them to catch their stride with the Our Gang kids, but they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Say, fella, I paid money to see a prize fight, not a baby cry. I want my money back right now. Well, what do you think you get for a baseball and a bean shooter? Jack Dempsey or Mickey Leonard?
Craig Ragus, who's Elmer Ragus's grandson, lives up in Tulsa, and I've met him a couple of times. He's got incredible pictures, and he was the head of the sound department.
Yes, he helped me. He gave me permission to publish a few of the photographs he has.
Mm-hmm.
Very helpful, very helpful. Where do you live, Jim?
Dallas.
Oh, okay. Are you in Dallas also, Bill?
Not per se. I'm in Plano, which is a suburb on the northeast edge of Dallas.
Okay, very good.
Now, speaking of Our Gang, I mean, because there's a couple of things there that I found interesting too that you relayed in there. One was that there were apparently reports of imposters going around trying to supposedly recruit kids.
Yes, there were. I found letters to that effect. And of course, there was some character who, I don't have the notes in front of me, but in the 50s, didn't he try to pass himself off as one of the little rascals? And he was on one of the game shows in the 50s.
Was that Don Marlowe?
I don't recall the name.
There was a guy named Don Marlowe who tried to pass himself off as Porky. And
That's
he
right.
actually wrote a book. I've got a copy of his book.
Oh, I didn't know he wrote a book.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that sort of thing does happen. Did happen.
He should have collaborated with the guy who insisted he was Joe Besser. And also regarding Our Gang, well, this isn't just Our Gang, but I found it interesting. One article that you, or maybe it was a press release that you included in there, talking about the different types of fan mail that the various Roach stars would receive.
Oh, yes, that was quite fascinating. All these, so there was just, can you imagine the plethora of documents I went through and trying to organize everything? Out of the blue, I'd get a publicity release of a questionnaire they sent out. And yes, I don't have the exact page number here, but it was surprising how many professional men wrote fan letters to Laurel and Hardy, as opposed to, maybe working men or whatnot. That sort of thing was all quite fascinating and interesting.
Yeah, I've got to say, you may have changed my mind about Henry Ginsberg.
Oh, good. Yes. Because, there's hearsay. There's obviously the pressure of saving money during the Depression was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
And it just so happened that virtually all of Ginsberg's letters were in the archives. Otherwise, I never would have known myself. And I want to give credit where credit was due. He loved his job. He moved out from New York. There were personal letters to his family saying how much he loved being there at the Hal Roach Studios. And they were doing everything they could to keep things going. They had to make drastic decisions regarding, expenditures and all that sort of thing. And I could understand how the performers would be a little pissed that they couldn't joke around as long as they used to. But things were changing, It went from being very casual and informal to, well, can you imagine how structured and rigid everything is today?
Yeah.
Plus, some of these execs were wanting to can the Our Gang series in the mid 33, I think it was, and Ginsberg fought to keep them.
Yeah, I was shocked at that.
Yeah, I was too. These are these unbelievable letters that I would find, so I made it a point of pointing these out. Plus the fact that Ginsberg himself is the one who proposed a Best Short category for the Academy Awards. 1932, and they accepted his proposition, and sure enough, the Music Box won for that year.
It was kind of surprising that they would want to can the Our Gangs and then 2 years later actually buy the series.
Well, the ways of Hollywood are sometimes mysterious.
Yeah, we've spoken so much about the shorts, but it's worth pointing out some of the features that he did. I mean, you did mention the one where there was the difficulty with the stars, but going back to the silent era, then I guess the version of Call of the Wild that he produced. Now, that was the first adaptation of that novel, I'm guessing?
I believe it was, and I believe that was Hal Roach's first feature. I don't have all the, but I do know that years later, when he was interviewed, Roach kind of downplayed the dramas that he made, but Call of the Wild received such incredible, great reviews in those days. I mean, literally hailed as a great movie. I don't know if it's still in existence or not. Is it a lost film? I kind of think it is. But,
I've never seen it.
Yeah, isn't that a shame? But literally in 1923, the reviews were fantastic for it. I quote a few of them in my book.
Yeah.
So, and then he made some features with his new young actor who replaced Harold Lloyd named Glenn Tryon. By the way, Glenn Tryon's son became a very well-known actor and writer in the
Tom
60s
Tryon?
and Tom Tryon, yes.
Oh, okay.
That's his father, Glenn.
That's interesting.
Right.
And then he also, of course, made a feature expanding from the Our Gang, the movie General Spanky.
Oh, yeah, 1936. Yeah. See, Roach just would try all sorts of...
Well, he tried out a feature for everybody, and except for Charlie Chase's, they all seemed to work.
Well, even Charlie Chase, I think it was called Neighborhood House. They created it as a feature, and for some reason, people kept saying it's not working as a feature, and they cut it down to a short. That's another mystery.
Well, the story I heard was that because it was called Bank Night, the feature version.
Oh, yes.
And Bank Night was a corporation that used to do these dish giveaways and that sort of thing at movie theaters.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess they threatened to sue. So.
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
I didn't know all the details.
So they had to cut out all, references to Bank Night.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
I remember the silent short Movie Night. I think that may have been the first Charlie Chase I ever saw. So was this kind of an expansion on that?
It's similar. Yeah. But Movie Night's much better.
Okay.
Charlie
And then
Chase, yeah. I wondered why he left Roach in 1936 after this. He was also in a really good comedy feature called Kelly the Second.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a good role in that. But for some reason, by 36, Hal Roach was really steering away from shorts and the sort of slapsticky stuff, except for Laurel and Hardy and the Our Gang. They were still with him. But I don't know really why Charlie Chase left the Roach
It had
Studios.
something to do with his drinking.
Oh.
Because he almost died 2 or 3 times in the 30s.
That's right. Could be that. Well, it's nice that Charlie did pick up his career and lasted for a whole bunch of other shorts at Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are the ones that I've got. Although I did just order a set of the Jimmy Jump shorts from Grapevine Video.
Ah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing those.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
A lot of, by the way, a lot of apparently the MGM silence. So Roach switched over to MGM after Pathé. He signed a deal with MGM in the spring of 1926, but it wasn't until the fall of 27 that MGM began releasing his shorts. So you had mentioned MGM earlier. That could be the confusion. So a number of...
I don't need that much help to be confused.
A number of the Pathé films were actually released after MGM was releasing some of... But apparently, MGM did not take good care of the last silence they made in 29. So
that happened with a lot of late silence.
So didn't a lot of Charlie Chase's late silence disappear?
There's a few. Yeah, there's more missing right in those last 5 years, I think, than elsewhere in his career.
Which is really sad because he was just terrific in those days.
Oh, he was really hitting his stride in those late silence.
Yes. So the fact that they're not there, a number of them are not there is sad. And let's hope. Mm-hmm. Well, I asked Hal Roach, hats off. Is there any earthly reason why that film is completely missing? And I asked Hal Roach. He said, I don't understand it. He said, I gave a copy of every film I ever made to the Cinémathèque Française. Wouldn't they have it somewhere in their basement? Or what about in New Zealand or Australia? The last leg of the exhibition, destinations. There's gotta be something.
I tend to think if it was, we probably would have heard by now because they're looking everywhere for this stuff.
Or some collector is just being very greedy, and he's waiting until 2027, the 100th anniversary of Hats Off, to reveal it. Let's hope so, anyway.
Well, about 10 years ago was when they found the second reel of Battle of the Century.
That's right.
Yeah.
all kinds of amazing. And what about Duck Soup? The film that literally is Laurel and Hardy's first real starring teaming. That was discovered in the 70s and it's now available. I can't wait to see the new Blu-ray 1927 releases.
I checked the tracking on it, and my copy is supposed to arrive today. So,
great! I hope you do you have a Facebook or a website, and you can give a report about it?
Well, I guess I could. I haven't.
I bet
done
a lot
it before,
of people would like to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's going to be a lot of people writing about this.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, looks like we've nowhere near exhausted the subject, which is good because otherwise then there wouldn't be
It's
as
impossible.
much appealing.
With the career
to
of
the book.
Hal Roach spanning the years, I didn't even get to the television years.
Right. Yeah. Or we didn't talk about, Topper, 1 million BC, so.
Well, if you ever want to interview me again, we could have a part 2.
That's true, but gosh, you should see the line that I've got at this point. But this is good because it teases it and hopefully will entice people to order the book. I've got to say, I cannot imagine a more detailed book covering someone's career. I mean,
wait a minute. I got to interrupt you there.
Okay.
Yes, you can. You imagine it. Because
well, you'll have
I will
to
reveal
prompt me.
I am going to reveal. You are going to get the exclusive scoop, Mr. Groves, that I am now 6 months into my updated version of my Hal Roach book. I have discovered more materials. I have almost perhaps a bombshell revelation.
Really?
And yes. And I am filling it. I said, this is the time I've got to share what I've discovered. And there have been a number of fantastic film trade journals that had never been scanned and put on the internet until the last couple of years. Some fantastic publications with some great writers. Some of these journals only lasted a year or less, but they included some excellent writers just devoted to the art of motion pictures. They covered Hal Roach's productions in amazing detail, interviewed a lot of his obscure employees, and I have uncovered amazing new treasures that I am in the midst of compiling almost a brand new book.
That's great.
Okay. Well, in any case, for listeners who want to go ahead and get the current version of the book, if you haven't completely.
Yes. I mean, that represents years of research and refinement and corrections. Fans would write in, experts would write in and say, did you know this? Do you know that? Just as Jim is telling me, they found another Lonesome Luke. So I would, and thank goodness my book is print on demand, and my publisher, Ben Omart, is so patient and understanding. He's allowed me, I have had to do 4 updates on that book alone because I know Mr. Roach. I'm doing this in his honor. This has been a labor of love. He was one of the finest men I ever knew. He befriended me as a unknown 20-year-old and maintained a friendship with me for nearly 20 years. I'd never known anyone with such integrity, kindness, and dedication to doing the best he can all through his life. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book. Correct any error, explore any mystery, and just do the best I can. So Mr. Roach will say, good job, Craig.
Yeah. Well, it's an impressive accomplishment. And as I say, for any listeners who are interested in the book, visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website, go to the bookshelf page, and you'll find an Amazon link where you can order the book. Also on the screening room page, there will be a number of films and collections of films that we've talked about with these various stars that became popular under Hal Roach's tutelage, shall we say. And that brings me to the standard closing question for my guest, which is, Craig, what is your most memorable movie-going experience?
I thought about that. I have 2. Well, there was a movie going where I actually was at the movie theater. And another one, equally as memorable, was in 1958. I was 5 years old. And I remember, I'll never forget this as long as I live. My mother said, we're going to go see movie stars. We were living in San Diego, California. We get in the car. Remember, my dad had a black Renault Dauphine, I think they called it. We went to the dock. We drove our car onto a ferry boat. The ferry boat went to Coronado Island, just off San Diego. We found ourselves at the Coronado Hotel, the Del Coronado Hotel, this fantastic Victorian resort hotel, and I'd never seen anything like it before. We went down to the beach. There were cameras and tripods and equipment and a crowd of people on the beach. And I didn't know what was going on. I don't know how my parents knew about it, who they knew. I think my father might have known someone in Hollywood at the time. And I remember going down to the beach and watching them film a scene of a beautiful blonde woman coming out of the ocean like Venus, the most beautiful young woman I'd ever seen in my life. She came rushing past me. I know the spray of the water hit me. She ran into the arms of someone who threw a big bathrobe, plush bathrobe around her. And off she went. And my mother said, "That's a movie star. Her name is Marilyn Monroe."
Oh,
They were filming a scene from Some Like It Hot.
oh wow. The memorable movie making experience there. So what's the memorable movie going experience?
Okay, not as pleasant. A year later, 1959, I was 6 years old. For some reason, my parents took me to the movies. They had no idea what the movie was, but I have never forgotten the nightmare scene I remember watching. Another beautiful star, her name was Elizabeth Taylor, and she was being groped by mad people in a lunatic asylum. Do you know what scene that was from, what movie?
It's not coming to mind.
Suddenly Last Summer.
Ah.
Mm. But it was a scary movie. And up to that scene, that's when my mother said, I don't think we better stay to the rest of this movie. Let's get out of here. But I've never forgotten it. Years later, when I saw it on television, I said, "Oh my God, there's that scene I've never forgotten." It was from Suddenly Last Summer. Well, on a lighter note, I did get to meet the author of that movie, Tennessee Williams.
Really?
Oh, wow. I met a lot of celebrities in New York City when I was there back in the 80s. Yeah, late 70s through the 80s. I was quite an adventurous character. That's a whole other story. Maybe one day I may write my own autobiography.
Oh, that works. All right. Well, Craig, thank you for sharing your time and giving us the audible version of some of these stories that you've recounted in your book. Jim, it's good to have you in there again, backstopping me.
Thanks, Bill.
Contributing in ways that I couldn't. This has been great. So once again, Craig, thank you for joining us on Movie Nights and Matinees.
Thank you so much, Bill, and nice to meet you, Jim. This has been a real pleasure.
Thanks again to you listeners. And in case I didn't make the point forcefully enough, if you'd like to get yourself a copy of Craig's book, 100 Years of Brodies with Hal Roach, just swing by the Movie Nights and Matinees bookshelf page, where you can order it via Amazon. Likewise, going to the screening room page will provide you with a selection of Hal Roach films and collections on DVD and or Blu-ray, including the Laurel and Hardy First Year collection that Jim mentioned. If you haven't already, please hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen, and leave a rating along with a review where possible. On the website, you can offer up comments or questions via the comments link, which you can also do on the Facebook page. There's a link for that on the website as well. Well, that takes care of episode 15. Time for me to wander over to episode 16.
You fool. By coming here, you put yourself completely in my hands.